Richard Harris is a man called Horse. He goes west.
They didn't just hang Richard Harris from hooks, they pierced his skin for real. A British lord stripped, starved, and tortured on camera. One ritual went so wrong, Harris passed out mid-scene. And the woman playing his Sioux mother? She was a dame from Australia who'd never ridden a horse. These are 20 weird facts about a man called Horse. And the bonus, well, even the Native American consultants walked off set. Buckle up, this ride gets brutal fast. Number 1. Richard Harris didn't audition for the role of Lord John Morgan, he fought for it. When the script landed on his desk in 1969, every major studio had already passed. Too violent, too graphic, too risky. The story of a British aristocrat captured and enslaved by Sioux Indians wasn't exactly family entertainment. The major studios wanted westerns with clear heroes and villains, not complex character studies about cultural transformation and spiritual suffering. But Harris saw something else entirely. He saw a chance to strip away everything. The titles, the privilege, the ego. To play a man reduced to nothing and rebuilt into something entirely different. This wasn't just another role. It was a complete deconstruction of Western civilization itself. Harris had spent years playing kings, warriors, and larger-than-life figures. He was tired of the costumes and the grandstanding. He wanted to play someone who lost everything, including his dignity. So he called producer Sandy Howard at 2 a.m., woke him up, and said one thing: "I'll do anything. I'll starve myself. I'll hang from hooks. I'll live in the dirt. But this film gets made, and I'm the lead." Howard was half asleep, confused, wondering if this Oscar-nominated actor was having some kind of breakdown. But Harris kept talking. He laid out his vision for the character scene by scene, explaining how he'd transform his body, how he'd learn the language, how he'd submit to every physical challenge the role demanded. Howard didn't need convincing after that, because when an Oscar-nominated actor offers to suffer for real, you don't say no. You just hand him the contract and prepare for chaos.
He is treated like a...
Number 2. Before cameras rolled, Harris made a decision that would haunt the entire production. No stunt doubles. Not for the fights, not for the horse scenes, and definitely not for the sunvow ceremony. He told director Elliot Silverstein in their first meeting, "If we fake this, the audience will know. If I don't bleed, they won't believe." Silverstein had worked with difficult actors before, but this was different. Harris wasn't being difficult. He was being dangerously committed. The insurance company went ballistic when they found out. They threatened to pull coverage entirely. The studio lawyers drafted clause after clause trying to protect themselves. But Harris signed everything without reading it, so he trained for months before filming began. He relocated to South Dakota weeks early and lived with a Sioux community. He learned to ride bareback on horses that hadn't been broken for Western saddles. He practiced hand-to-hand combat with real Sioux advisors who didn't pull their punches. He sat through hours of cultural education, learning the language, the customs, the spiritual beliefs. And when they told him the sunvows scene would require actual chest piercings, he didn't flinch. He asked how deep the hooks would go and when they could start filming. The crew thought he was insane, but Harris knew something they didn't. Pain on camera doesn't lie. You can fake a punch, but you can't fake genuine suffering. And for this film to work, every ounce of suffering had to be real. Number 3. Dame Judith Anderson was one of the most respected actresses in the world, nominated for an Academy Award for her role in Rebecca, a legend of stage and screen. And when she agreed to play Buffalo Cow Head, a Sioux woman who becomes Morgan's adoptive mother, she walked into a nightmare she wasn't prepared for. Anderson had never ridden a horse, not once in her entire life. She'd built her career on Shakespeare and Tennessee Williams, on controlled theater spaces. But her character lived on horseback. The Sioux were nomadic plains people. Riding was as natural to them as breathing. And here was Dame Judith Anderson, at 71 years old, being asked to climb onto a half-wild horse and act like she'd done it her whole life. The wranglers tried to give her the gentlest horse on set, a docile mare named Bella. But the moment Anderson settled into position, something spooked the animal. Bella bolted, tearing across the prairie with Anderson clinging to her neck, screaming. Harris himself mounted a horse and chased after her, finally grabbing Bella's reins. Anderson slid off, shaking, her costume torn. She had bruised ribs and a sprained wrist. Silverstein offered to rewrite her scenes, to minimize the riding. Anderson looked at him like he'd insulted her entire career. "I'll do it again," she said. "Tomorrow morning, same horse." And she did. She fell twice more in the first week. Each time she got back on. And she never complained, not once. Harris later said she was tougher than anyone on that set, because while he chose the pain, Anderson endured it without warning. Number 4. The sunvow ceremony wasn't invented for the movie. It was real, a sacred Sioux ritual reserved for warriors seeking visions or spiritual strength. Wooden skewers pierced through the chest muscles, attached to ropes, tied to a sacred tree. The warrior would dance and pull until the skewers tore free or they passed out. When Silverstein decided to film it, he knew they were walking into dangerous territory. This wasn't just a dramatic set piece. It was a religious ceremony with centuries of spiritual significance. So they hired real Sioux consultants who had witnessed the ceremony before it was suppressed. They studied photographs from the late 1800s. They built the ceremony space according to traditional designs, using authentic materials, sacred colors, proper positioning. But when it came time to film, Harris insisted on real piercings, not prosthetics, not camera tricks. He wanted the hooks to actually pierce his skin. The studio said no. The insurance company said absolutely not. And Harris said, "Then we don't have a movie." For 3 days, production halted while everyone argued. Executives flew in from Los Angeles. Harris refused to budge. In the end, they compromised. The hooks were dulled, carefully positioned, and supported by hidden harnesses. But Harris still hung there, still pulled against the weight, still screamed like his soul was tearing apart. And when he passed out halfway through the take, they kept rolling. Because that moment, that collapse, it was the most honest thing ever put on film. Silverstein watched the playback with tears in his eyes. Number 5. Filming took place in the Badlands of South Dakota, near the Pine Ridge Reservation. No hotels, no trailers, no catering trucks, just dirt, wind, and a small crew living in tents. The production design team found a valley that looked unchanged since the 1820s. Rolling hills, rocky outcroppings, not a telephone pole in sight. It was perfect visually but hell practically. The summer heat topped 100 degrees regularly. The crew melted while Harris performed nearly naked, but the worst part was the isolation. They were miles from the nearest town. No phones, no medical facilities, everything had to be trucked in. When someone got hurt, and people got hurt constantly, they had to drive an hour for help. Sprained ankles became common. Dehydration hit like a plague. One crew member broke his arm when a horse threw him into a ravine. They splinted it with sticks and kept shooting, because stopping meant losing light, and losing light meant losing money. The cinematographer passed out twice. Equipment malfunctioned in the dust, and through it all, Harris never complained. He sat in the dirt between takes, drinking warm water, waiting. And the footage looked real because it was. No studio backlot could replicate that authentic misery. You can feel it in every frame.
Mean, vicious, ignorant, superstitious.
Number 6. Harris lost 25 pounds for the role. He didn't use a trainer or dietitian. He just stopped eating. For weeks, he survived on water, black coffee, and occasional fruit. No protein, no substantial calories. By the time cameras rolled, his ribs were visible. His face looked hollow, his body looked broken. And that was the point. Lord John Morgan was stripped of everything. Harris wanted the audience to feel that loss physically, but the starvation took its toll. He was weak, constantly dizzy, unable to film long takes. His hands shook. He fainted twice during rehearsals. The medic begged him to eat something substantial. Harris refused. "Morgan doesn't get to eat," he'd say, "so neither do I." It wasn't method acting, it was self-destruction. His co-stars were genuinely worried. Judith Anderson tried to sneak him food. He gave it away. By the end, Harris could barely walk. His immune system was shot, but when you watch the film, you see it. That gaunt look in his eyes, the way his body moves like every step costs him something. That wasn't makeup, that was hunger, real and unforgettable. Number 7. The Sioux consultants didn't stick around. At first they were thrilled. A film actually trying to depict their culture accurately. They taught traditional dances, they helped design authentic clothing, they corrected pronunciation. But as filming went on, tensions rose. Some advisors felt the film was exploiting their sacred rituals for entertainment. Others worried that depicting the sunvow ceremony violated its spiritual meaning. There were heated arguments late at night. Silverstein insisted he was honoring their culture. Some consultants agreed, others didn't. By the third week, half of them had left. They didn't make a scene. They just quietly packed up and walked off set. Silverstein was devastated. He thought he was doing the right thing, but some of the very people he was trying to honor felt betrayed. It became a painful lesson that even with the best intentions, depicting another culture's sacred practices is a minefield. And sometimes, respect means knowing when not to show something at all. Number 8. The studio wanted Steve McQueen. When the script first circulated, executives pushed hard for a bigger name. McQueen was the king of cool, the biggest box office draw in Hollywood. So they sent him the script. McQueen read it over a weekend and passed. He didn't want to spend months in the dirt. He didn't want to play a character who spends half the film humiliated and enslaved. He wanted action, cars, guns, not spiritual suffering. So they offered it to Robert Redford. He also passed. Then Paul Newman, also Number. By the time it reached Richard Harris, the studio had given up on landing a major star. They just needed someone crazy enough to say yes, and Harris was eager. He saw the role everyone else rejected as the opportunity of a lifetime. And he was right, because while McQueen, Redford, and Newman played it safe, Harris hung from hooks and became a legend. Number 9. One scene nearly shut down production, a brutal fight between Harris and a rival warrior. No choreography, no stunt pads, just two men in the dirt. They rehearsed once lightly, then went full speed. Within 30 seconds, it went wrong. The stunt performer threw Harris harder than planned. Harris came up swinging. They crashed into each other, genuinely fighting. Harris took an elbow to the face and his nose shattered. Blood poured down his chest. The crew screamed, "Cut!" But Harris kept going. He thought the cameras were still rolling. By the time someone pulled him away, his face was swollen. They rushed him to the hospital. The doctors said he needed surgery and would be out for weeks. The production would collapse. Harris refused. He told them to set the bone without anesthesia, wrap it, and get him back to set. 2 days later, nose crooked, face purple, Harris was back filming, and you can see it in the final cut. His face is asymmetrical. His breathing sounds labored. But he didn't stop, because for Richard Harris this wasn't just a movie, it was a test, and he was determined to pass. Number 10. The film's most controversial moment wasn't the sun vow ceremony. It was the scene where Morgan is treated like an animal, stripped naked, tied to a post, fed scraps, made to crawl. The sequence lasts nearly 10 minutes. Audiences in 1970 were shocked. Some walked out. Others demanded refunds. Critics called it exploitative and unnecessarily brutal, but Silverstein defended it. He said the humiliation wasn't gratuitous, it was essential, because only by losing his humanity could Morgan gain it back in a different form. Harris agreed. He said playing those scenes was the most humiliating experience of his career, but that was the point. He wanted the audience to feel uncomfortable, and it worked. Despite the controversy, audiences kept coming back. They didn't just watch a man suffer, they watched him become something new. And that journey, brutal as it was, became the heart of the film. Number 11. The film's most iconic costume piece, Morgan's loincloth, was made from actual deer skin provided by the Sioux consultants, but Harris refused to wear the protective undergarments the costume department provided. He said it would affect how he moved, how the leather sat against his skin, how authentic the performance felt. So for months of filming, he wore nothing but that thin piece of leather between himself and the elements. The chafing was immediate and brutal. By the end of the first week, his skin was raw and bleeding. The medic offered creams, bandages, padding. Harris declined everything. He said Morgan wouldn't have access to modern medicine, so neither would he. The crew watched in horror as Harris limped between takes, his legs covered in sores that wouldn't heal in the heat and dust. Infections developed. The medic warned him about sepsis, about permanent scarring, about the very real possibility of needing hospitalization. Harris just nodded and kept filming. By the end of production, his inner thighs were a mess of scars that never fully faded. Years later, in interviews, Harris would joke that he could always tell which leg was which in the shower because the scarring was so distinctive. But it wasn't really a joke, it was a permanent reminder of what he'd sacrificed for the role, literally written into his skin. The medic offered creams, bandages, padding. Harris declined everything. He said Morgan wouldn't have access to modern medicine, so neither would he. The crew watched in horror as Harris limped between takes, his legs covered in sores that wouldn't heal in the heat and dust. Infections developed. The medic warned him about sepsis, about permanent scarring, about the very real possibility of needing hospitalization. Harris just nodded and kept filming. By the end of production, his inner thighs were a mess of scars that never fully faded. Years later, in interviews, Harris would joke that he could always tell which leg was which in the shower because the scarring was so distinctive. But it wasn't really a joke. It was a permanent reminder of what he'd sacrificed for the role, literally written into his skin. Number 12. The language barrier wasn't just a challenge for the actors, it became a source of genuine conflict on set. Harris spent months learning Lakota Sioux, working with language consultants to get the pronunciation perfect. But many of the Native American actors cast in smaller roles spoke different tribal languages, or no indigenous language at all. Some had grown up on reservations where English was forced upon them and their native tongues suppressed. Others were urban Indians who'd never learned their ancestral languages. So when Silverstein called action and expected scenes to flow in Lakota, chaos erupted. Actors stumbled over words they'd learned phonetically but didn't understand. Harris, who'd actually studied the meaning behind the words, would stop mid-scene and correct people, which didn't endear him to everyone. Some of the native actors resented a white British man lecturing them about their own culture's language. Tensions exploded one afternoon when Harris stopped a take for the 5th time to correct someone's pronunciation. The actor, a Lakota man named Chief Dan George, finally snapped. "My grandfather spoke this language," he said. "Your grandfather colonized the people who spoke it. Maybe sit down." The set went silent. Harris stood there, processing, then nodded and apologized. From that point on, he kept his corrections to himself, unless asked directly. It was a humbling moment that reminded everyone that despite the best intentions, they were still making a Hollywood film about a culture that had been systematically oppressed. And that tension, that uncomfortable truth hung over the production like a storm cloud that never quite broke. Number 13. The buffalo hunt scene required 50 animals and nearly killed half the stunt team. The production couldn't use real buffalo, they were too unpredictable and dangerous, so they trucked in domesticated bison from a ranch in Wyoming, animals that had been raised around humans and were supposedly docile. Supposedly. The plan was to film the actors on horseback chasing the herd across open prairie, using long lenses to make it look more dramatic than it was. But on the day of the shoot, someone forgot to properly secure one section of the perimeter fence. When the cameras started rolling and horses began thundering toward the herd, the bison panicked and stampeded straight toward the gap, 2 tons of terrified animal moving at 30 miles an hour, heading directly toward the crew. Everyone scattered, diving behind equipment trucks, climbing onto camera platforms, sprinting for higher ground. One assistant director wasn't fast enough. A bison clipped him as it passed, sending him spinning 15 feet through the air. He landed hard, broke 3 ribs and his collarbone. Another crew member got trampled, not by the bison but by the horse he'd been trying to mount to get away. The horse reared, came down on his leg, shattered his ankle. It took 2 hours to round up all the bison. By then, the light was gone, and they'd lost the entire day of shooting. The next morning, they tried again with triple the fencing and every safety precaution they could imagine, and it worked, barely. The footage made it into the film, a sweeping, epic shot of man and beast in motion. But everyone who was there remembered the terror, the chaos, the very real sense that someone could have died that day. Number 14. Judith Anderson's most powerful scene wasn't scripted. Toward the end of the film, after Morgan has been accepted into the tribe and adopted as her son, Buffalo Cowhead sits with him by the fire. In the script, she was supposed to deliver a short speech about family and belonging, maybe 30 seconds of dialogue. Anderson went off script. She began speaking in a mixture of broken English and Lakota phrases she'd learned from the consultants. talking about loss, about watching her culture disappear, about the pain of seeing young people forget the old ways. She wasn't playing Buffalo Cowhead anymore. She was channeling something deeper, something real. The words came from conversations she'd had with elderly Sioux women on the reservation, stories they'd shared about children taken to boarding schools, about languages forbidden, about traditions dying. Harris sat there in character, tears running down his face, because he understood he was witnessing something beyond acting. Silverstein kept the cameras rolling, not daring to call cut. The scene went on for nearly 4 minutes. This elderly white Australian actress pouring out the grief of a people she'd only recently met but had come to deeply respect. When she finally stopped, the entire set was silent. Anderson stood up, brushed off her costume, and walked away without a word. In editing, Silverstein couldn't cut it. He restructured the entire sequence around that one unscripted moment, and it became the emotional core of the film. The moment where everything Morgan had experienced crystallized into understanding. Critics later called it one of the most powerful performances of Anderson's career. She never talked about it publicly, never explained where it came from. Some things, she believed, were too sacred to explain.
Vicious, ignorant, superstitious.
Number 15. The film's most dangerous stunt involved fire, horses, and Richard Harris's absolute refusal to use safety equipment. In one sequence, Morgan must ride through a burning village while warriors attack from all sides. The plan was straightforward: pre-burn structures in a controlled way, have Harris ride through on a trained stunt horse, cut to wider shots with stunt doubles for anything risky. Harris had other ideas. He insisted on riding his own horse, the half-wild mare he'd been training with for months, and he wanted to do it in one continuous take. No cuts, no safety net. The stunt coordinator begged him to reconsider. Fire is unpredictable. Horses are unpredictable. Combining them while galloping full speed through falling debris was asking for disaster. Harris didn't care. They spent a full day planning the shot, mapping every movement, calculating wind direction, timing the burns precisely. On the day, they lit the fires and waited for them to reach the right intensity. Then Harris mounted up, took a deep breath, and charged in. For 45 seconds, he disappeared into smoke and flame while the crew held their collective breath. The horse stumbled once, nearly throwing him into a burning structure. Embers landed on his bare back, sizzling against his skin. He kept riding, kept the horse under control, emerged on the other side singed but intact. Silverstein called cut and immediately ordered medics to treat the burns on Harris's shoulders and back. Second-degree burns, painful but not serious. They wrapped him in bandages and prepared to call it a day. Harris ripped the bandages off. "One more take," he said. "I can do it better." They didn't do another take. Silverstein, for once, put his foot down. What they'd captured was perfect, and he wasn't going to risk his lead actor's life for a slightly better angle. Harris was furious, convinced he'd failed somehow. It took him weeks to watch the footage and admit that maybe, just maybe, he'd pushed far enough. Number 16. The musical score almost destroyed the film's authenticity. The studio hired a traditional Hollywood composer who delivered a sweeping orchestral soundtrack full of strings and French horns and dramatic crescendos. It sounded expensive, it sounded professional, and it sounded completely wrong. Silverstein listened to the first recordings and immediately knew they had a problem. The music was drowning out the story, imposing European sensibilities onto a Native American narrative. It was exactly what they'd been trying to avoid. So he fired the composer, ate the cost, and started over. This time he brought in the Sioux consultants and asked them about traditional music. They introduced him to tribal drummers and singers who'd been performing ceremonial music for decades. Silverstein recorded hours of authentic Sioux music, chants and drums and flutes, sounds that had existed long before any Hollywood orchestra. Then he wove these recordings throughout the film, using orchestral elements sparingly and only when absolutely necessary. The studio executives hated it. They said it sounded primitive, unfinished, not cinematic enough. They threatened to release the film with no music at all, rather than this amateur soundtrack. Silverstein threatened to quit. It became a standoff that lasted weeks, with lawyers involved and contracts examined. Finally, They tested both versions with audiences. The authentic score won decisively. People said it made them feel transported, like they were actually watching something real rather than a Hollywood production. The studio backed down, the authentic score stayed, and it became one of the most praised elements of the film. Sometimes authenticity means rejecting everything Hollywood thinks it knows. Number 17. The ending of the film caused massive arguments that nearly tore the production apart. In the original script, Morgan fully assimilates into the tribe and the film ends, with him leading a successful raid against enemy warriors, having completely transformed into a Sioux warrior. It was triumphant, satisfying, exactly what audiences would expect. Harris hated it. He argued that the ending was a white fantasy, the idea that a European could simply become indigenous after a few months of suffering. He said it disrespected the complexity of cultural identity and the reality that Morgan would always be, at some level, an outsider. He pushed for a more ambiguous ending, one that acknowledged his transformation but didn't pretend the cultural gap had been completely bridged. Silverstein disagreed. The studio disagreed. Even some of the Sioux consultants disagreed, saying that adoption into the tribe was real and complete in their tradition. The arguments went on for weeks. Scripts were rewritten multiple times. Actors took sides. The production split into factions. Finally, they shot multiple endings, planning to decide in editing which worked best. The final version is deliberately ambiguous. Morgan has changed, has been accepted, has found a new identity. But the film ends with him looking back toward the horizon, toward the world he came from, suggesting that transformation is never quite complete. It satisfied no one completely, and maybe that was the point, because real life doesn't offer neat endings. Identity is complicated, and sometimes the most honest choice is to leave questions unanswered. Number 18. The film's release sparked protests at theaters across the country. Native American activists picketed screenings, arguing that the film perpetuated the noble savage stereotype and centered a white man's experience in an indigenous story. They weren't wrong. Despite the consultation, despite the attempt at authenticity, the film ultimately follows a white protagonist's journey. The indigenous characters, no matter how respectfully portrayed, exist primarily to facilitate Morgan's transformation. It's his story, not theirs. Some theaters pulled the film after protests became disruptive. Others held forums after screenings where activists could speak directly to audiences about the real history of Native American oppression. Silverstein attended several of these forums, listening to criticism, defending some choices, acknowledging failures in others. He later said it was the most educational experience of his career. The film he thought was progressive and respectful was, to many Native Americans, just another example of their stories being told by and for white audiences. The controversy didn't kill the film commercially. It actually boosted ticket sales as people came to see what the fuss was about. But it complicated its legacy. Was it a groundbreaking attempt at cultural representation, or another example of appropriation? Decades later, the debate continues. And maybe that tension, that discomfort, is the film's most important contribution. It forces viewers to grapple with difficult questions about who gets to tell whose stories.
When you first brought me here, you said I was a horse.
Number 19. Richard Harris never fully recovered from the film, physically or emotionally. The weight loss, the infections, the broken nose, the burns, they left permanent marks. But deeper than that, the role changed something in him. He'd gone into the production as a confident, somewhat arrogant British actor. He emerged questioning everything about his identity, his culture, his place in the world. For months after filming wrapped, he struggled to readjust to normal life. He couldn't sleep in a bed. It felt too soft, too foreign. He couldn't tolerate London's crowds and noise. He spent weeks alone in a cottage in Ireland, not quite sure who he was anymore. Friends said he'd become obsessed with Native American history, reading everything he could find, donating money to indigenous causes. He tried to visit reservations but was turned away, told that his presence, however well-intentioned, wasn't welcome. He understood, but it hurt. In interviews years later, Harris would say that playing Lord John Morgan was the greatest and worst experience of his career. Greatest because he'd achieved something he'd never thought possible, a complete transformation. Worse, because he'd never found his way completely back. Part of him, he said, was still tied to that post in the dirt, still hanging from those hooks, still searching for an identity that existed somewhere between two worlds. It wasn't method acting, it was genuine loss, and he carried it with him until he died. Number 20. The film spawned two sequels that Harris immediately regretted: The Return of a Man Called Horse in 1976 and Triumphs of a Man Called Horse in 1983. Both were made purely for money, with smaller budgets, less cultural consultation, and none of the raw intensity of the original. Harris signed on because he needed the paychecks, his career having hit financial difficulties. But he hated every moment of filming. The sequels felt exploitative, turning what had been a brutal examination of cultural clash into simple adventure stories. The Sioux advisors from the first film refused to participate. Critics savaged both movies, and audiences could tell the difference. What had been dangerous and transformative became safe and commercial. Harris rarely spoke about the sequels. In his autobiography, he devoted dozens of pages to the original film and less than a paragraph to its follow-ups. He called them "the price I paid for getting the first one made," because Hollywood operates on a simple principle: if something makes money, do it again until it stops making money. Art doesn't matter, truth doesn't matter, only the bottom line. And sometimes the legacy of a groundbreaking film is tarnished not by what it was, but by what it became. The original Man Called Horse asked difficult questions and demanded real suffering in pursuit of authenticity. The sequels asked nothing and offered only empty spectacle, and in that difference lies everything wrong with how Hollywood treats stories that should matter.